A while back, somebody asked me what Krishnamurti did for me. They were referring to me saying how important was his writing for me, quite a few years ago when I was in my late 20s. Of course, I'm referring to Judo Krishnamurti and not U.G. Krishnamurti, period. Although U.G. Krishnamurti has some pretty interesting things to say, but that wasn't a primary influence for me, period. I was going through a period of wanting to broaden my mind, and yet it was pretty unconscious. I didn't become aware of what I was doing till after I observed the process I was going through. The process seemed to be that wherever I was in my mind, as far as my assumptions and beliefs were, I would spend a lot of time going to the bookstores, and I would look through the books and I would try and find a book that would take off from where I was. In other words, my assumptions and beliefs were, say, at position, F in the alphabet. And I wanted to keep moving through the alphabet to make a metaphor. And so I would try and find a book that was close to F, but moving to the next letter, so to speak, period. Well, I walked into the bookstore and was looking around, and I saw a very small paperback, and I loved the picture on the cover. It was a profile of Krishnamurti's face. I really liked the face. It looked very wise, very intelligent, and androgynous. I could see both male and female in the face. So it was very serious face, but at the same time looked profound. Now, what can you say about a picture of someone's face looking profound? But that's what I thought. The title of the book was "You Are the World," and I thought, wow, that's a really amazing title. You are the world. In my mind, I'm like, no, I'm this little guy here, being an intellectual, trying to figure things out, and so who am I to take on the position that I am the world? Well, of course, I had to buy the book, and so I brought it home, and my wife and kids were asleep, and I started reading, and I read, and I read. I read late into the night, as was my habit. I worked all day in an office, and so the only time I could really pursue my search for enlightenment was in the evenings on weekends. And so I did a lot of late night reading. Well, anyways, I got halfway through the book, and I started feeling this overwhelming sense of forgiveness. Now, granted, I don't know anybody else who says they read Krishnamurti and felt a strong sense of forgiveness, but that's what I was feeling. And it became so strong that I thought, oh my, I'm going to be crying. So I went to the other end of the house and went into the small half bath, closed the door, and sat in the corner with the book, read a few more lines, and sure enough, I started crying. And I cried for a long time. The crying was like the crying that people do at weddings when they're really happy. It's almost as if when something really good happens, it creates a balance or actually disturbs a balance towards the positive side, and so that allows you to let go of some sadness. In my case, I had a lot of guilt, and reading Krishnamurti just took away so much of my feeling of guilt that I just had a sense of forgiveness. That really impressed me because I couldn't figure out how reading some words in a book could make me feel overwhelmed with forgiveness. And who doesn't want forgiveness? It's a beautiful thing. So I continued reading when I could, after I wiped away all the tears. And I went on a reading binge after that. I bought every book I could find by Krishnamurti, ordered them online, ordered books from India, and read everything I could. Now, I really couldn't understand what Krishnamurti was saying, and I'm not alone in that. I think many people would say that Krishnamurti is rather hard to follow. It's like you don't have a big groups all over the world studying Krishnamurti and gaining enlightenment. And I think it was because his writing and his approach was so personal that it didn't really fit in with, say, traditional Advaita Vedanta, period. So anyhow, when I read Krishnamurti, what I tried to do was in my mind, in my heart, try to imagine what the space was from which Krishnamurti wrote. In other words, I so appreciated what he was able to say and his attitude towards life and his peace and his calmness that even if I couldn't understand his words or his intellectual ideas in a manner that really made sense to me, I really tried to intuit the space he was in that would give me the understanding in such a way that I could stand in the same position that he stood. And the effect was really profound because I opened up quite a bit, and I became very sensitive to beauty. And for a long period of time, I would be watching TV, and just any show. It could be a cowboy, western, whatever. I'd be watching TV, and I would just be overcome with the beauty of something. There was a jazz singer on one day, and I just started crying because the beauty evidence in the person's face and in their singing just was overwhelming. I can remember my daughter crawling on my lap and saying, "Daddy, why are you crying?" And all I could say was, "Well, it's so beautiful." So, just as an aside, a number of years later, in talking with my dad, he was a little bit upset with my reading of Krishnamurti because he felt that I had had a conversion experience. Now, my dad, being a Baptist minister and a pretty staunch Christian, wanted people to convert to Christianity. He'd spent many years in Africa doing just that. From the way I talked about Krishnamurti, he just said, I think you had a conversion experience. And that was very honest of my dad, And it was when he was older and I was grown and had my own kids, so he wasn't quite as adamant about it. He couldn't do anything about it. But that's an interesting thing to at least take note of. I think one of the most profound things that freed me up by reading Krishnamurti was the fact of how he just had total disdain for tradition. At the time, I was very, very rebellious, and that really appealed to me. But coming from an authority figure such as Krishnamurti, who had disbanded the organization of the Star that was built around him from childhood and going off on his own, taking that to heart to let go of tradition was something I could do. And I had so much guilt, I believe, because I had been letting go of the beliefs I was brought up with. And letting go of those beliefs was like the biggest no-no, from everything I was taught as a child. And so I wanted to be free of that, and Krishnamurti was like a big step up. He repeatedly in his talks would say things like, well, go out in your backyard and find a stone that you like and put it up on your mantle above your fireplace, and every time you go by, look at it and think good thoughts about it, or say namaste to it, and soon enough that will be a sacred rock, and you might even begin to bow down to it and think that it brings you good luck or great fortune, etc. He really made a point of letting go of tradition, and that was really valuable for me. The other thing that he really stressed, well, let me see if I can formulate this the way I want to, or I'll have to come back to that. But Krishnamurti really, everything that he wrote was trying to free up the person and free you of guilt. And I had so much guilt, and he helped release it. The other thing Krishnamurti talked about was violence. And he brought it down to very discrete levels. And he pointed out, like, just the way someone looks at another, the way someone responds to another, the thoughts that aren't expressed about another, that they were all violent. And so he made it very clear that people were often violent hundreds of times a day, and just their little looks and responses and gossip and things they said about other people. And I was very angry because of the way I was brought up, so I had a lot of anger. And I think he gave me a sense that, I'm not the only one that's angry. And I have good reason to be angry. There's lots of angry people in the world, and I'm not the only one. So that was another freedom for me. I read Krishnamurti probably for 3 or 4 years very heavily, and eventually moved on to other things. I don't think that Krishnamurti allowed me to realize the self. I believe that came later. But I do think that Krishnamurti was a huge step up the ladder, if you want to call it a ladder, because he gave me permission, or showed all the reasons why tradition was a prison, and that people's minds weren't their own, and they weren't free, and they weren't spontaneous because they were bound up in the prison of tradition. His talk about how violent we all are, and how it shows up in so many small ways every day in everyday life, also allowed me to feel like my anger and my violence was not out of the norm or something that wasn't valid. So I moved on, and every few years or so I would pick up that book, You Are the World, and it was very heavily yellow highlighted because probably every third sentence I thought was significant and would highlight it. But I would read it and nothing there for me. It didn't move me. I couldn't even tell exactly what page or what line might have prompted my very freeing sense of forgiveness. So I think that's just a good example that our lives are not static. Well, hopefully they're not. That a particular writer can be immensely important at some point in our life, and later on, not that important. I have to honor what Krishnamurti wrote and the life that he lived. He was certainly an individual that one could say lived an original life, but I couldn't find a pathway or a handle or grasp the understanding of us actually being the self from Krishnamurti. I had to move on to other teachers. So my point is that, you know, just because a certain book that other people are talking about really is on your mind and you think you should get it, or that it should do for you what it did for somebody else, it doesn't work that way. I mean, probably most of us have bought a book and started to read it and said, nah, this doesn't cut it for me. I think I'm going to have to read something else. And you sort of think there's something there, but it's not for you right now. So you put it on the shelf. And then 5 years later, you're like, whoa, this is some heavy shit. Man, this is really good. I love it. So we're all on a path, and most traditions, not all, talk about levels or steps or markers along the way. So I would say that probably most spiritual traditions have a sense of levels, attainments, and I think if you're on the spiritual path, you're going to make progress if you're devoted to seeking the truth, whatever your path is, and there are many. And so I think that you read what resonates with you and what rocks your boat, and you keep going and you keep going and you keep going, and eventually something will click and you will go, I know I am that. And that realization may come with a heavy-duty experience, or it may just come as a, oh, I am that. Either way, it's a significant point. And at that point, you can sort of tell that something happened because your seeking stops. The intense drive to know ends. But that's not the end of the journey. In one sense, there's a whole after realization trip. And for one thing, you just become in love with the idea of being one with everything, your essence being that which created you, like Meister Eckhart saying, the eyes with which I see God are the eyes with which God sees me. So many statements like that from different mystics. But after you realize, all your assumptions and habits and traditions that you've stayed with will still be there, and it's going to take time, probably your whole life that you still have, to embody what you've realized. The realization is profound, and it brings a lot of peace, but there's still a lot of embodiment or actualization to put what you've realized into practice. And it's probably a good thing, because it gives us something to do after we're no longer seeking. Now, I still read quite a bit on the spiritual topics, primarily non-duality, Advaita Vedanta, etc. But I'm not reading because I'm seeking the answer. I'm reading because I enjoy it so much, and I like all the different perspectives of how do you describe this, because it's so hard to describe, and what teachers have the best way of describing what the path is that they teach. To be precise in how one talks about realization is very important, especially if you're a word person like I am. If you're going to talk about enlightenment with words and use logic and description and metaphor and allegory, the better you do that, the more likely someone's going to be touched by it and have an aha. Most of us who have realized the truth would like to bring everybody else along with us. So I think that's about what I have to say on Krishnamurti and how he helped me. Thank you for listening. Bye.